Story number 1. Dr. Death. I lived in London for the better part of my youth. I was born in Canada, but my family's business had us move to Europe when I was only 9 years old. That was a long time ago. I was living in central London between 1980 and 1990. Like I said, it was a long time ago. My parents were never really home much. They both worked hard, so it was usually just me and my little brother. This story took place during the winter holidays in 1986. My brother and I were off from school, but my parents had to keep working. This meant that we were home alone for most of the day. My brother and I weren't like most siblings our age. We got along pretty well since we were born only 1 year apart and had quite a lot in common. We got into a lot of trouble over that holiday. We'd just reached our early teens, and that meant we were getting adventurous. We often snuck out of the house and wandered around the streets alone. Now, if you know anything about central London, you know it's not exactly the best place for two young teenage boys to be wandering around all on their own. That's not the disturbing part of this story. The disturbing part comes in after my brother got hit by a car. We were fooling around near the road after leaving an internet cafe with a couple of drinks and some snacks. Neither of us was really paying attention, and he stumbled out into the road just as a large double-decker bus was turning the corner. You can imagine what happened next. He was okay for the most part, but his leg was twisted in an unnatural way by the knee, so the driver called an ambulance to take us to the hospital. I was distraught, and my brother was in pain, but we were both more worried about what our parents were going to say. The ambulance rushed us to the nearest hospital. I was tasked with giving the nurses all of our details and helping them call my parents. Then, they made me sit in the waiting room while the doctors took care of my brother. When my mother arrived, her face was basically like a giant tomato. I was terrified. My father showed up not too long after her, and even though his face was a lot more reserved than my mother's, I could tell he was just as furious. We waited, and eventually a doctor came out to greet us. He introduced himself as Dr. Harold Shipman. He was so charming and nice. My parents had a long chat with him about my brother, and he even agreed to take a look at me, since I seemed pretty shocked by the incident. I was alone in a room with him soon after that. I'll have to admit that I don't remember all of the details. A lot of it is a blur for me. All I can really remember is how worried I was that my parents were going to ground me when we got home. Anyway, the reason I'm telling you this is because of the doctor. Harold Shipman seemed like such a nice man. He made me laugh and joked about how he used to get into trouble when he was my age. I'd never really related to an adult as much as I did in that moment. My brother had dislocated his knee and torn a few ligaments in his leg, so he had to stay in the hospital for a while. Thankfully, the severity of his injuries kept my parents from being too angry with us. I remember visiting him in the hospital a lot before he was released. I met Dr. Harold again in the hallways and the parking lot during a few of the visits. He was my brother's doctor, so he got to see him every day. We both really enjoyed his company. My parents' job had us move again not long after that. We left central London and moved further into the country. It was quiet, and my parents were sure that we wouldn't get hit by any double-decker buses. I'll flash forward to quite a few years later. It was in the year 2000. I was sitting in a lounge watching the news by myself. My brother was out doing his own things, and my parents were shopping. The news was nothing special, but something caught my eye as I got up and headed towards the kitchen for a refresh on my drink. A face and a set of charming eyes that seemed so familiar to me flashed onto the screen. I didn't think anything of it at first. I was halfway into the kitchen when it hit me. I practically ran back into the lounge and threw myself onto the couch. It was Dr. Harold Shipman. I recognized his face instantly, even though he looked a bit older. My heart rose into my throat where it lodged itself and made it difficult for me to breathe. My stomach lurched, threatening to throw all the food I'd eaten that day onto the floor. Dr. Harold Shipman's face disappeared and was replaced with countless photos of elderly women, all of which had been declared deceased. I read the words, although I didn't believe any of them. They were calling him Dr. Death. My legs felt weak and I collapsed onto the couch. More images of Dr. Harold Shipman flashed onto the screen, and he was in handcuffs. The news said that he was suspected of killing over 200 of his patients. I was alone in a room with him. He was my brother's doctor. My family put all our trust into him, and it almost drove me crazy to see his face on the news with the title Dr. Death. My brother got home soon after that, and I think I gave him the biggest and longest hug. I even cried. It was a while before I told him what was happening. When I did, he just sort of sat there. It was like he didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to think. I just remember being glad that my brother hadn't been one of his victims. Story number 2, La Bistia. I've lived in Colombia most of my life, although I moved to Rio for a while when I was younger. I always knew I'd go back to Colombia. It's my home. It's the place where I was born, and it's the place where I lost my mother. Colombia is a wonderful place, but there is a lot of darkness hidden beneath the beauty. I went out with the girls, as I usually did on Saturday night. I was single by choice, and I loved getting dressed up and teasing the sexiest boys at the clubs. Sometimes I'd even let them take me home. I would never go alone. If you're from Colombia, then you know why. I always made sure my friends were with me. There were about 5 of us, but on that night, only 3 of us went out. We were all dressed to the nines. I had my best jewelry on, a bright red mini dress that hugged my body, and a pair of black thigh-high, high-heel boots. I was dressed for success. Success for me that night was getting free drinks all night long, and hopefully going home with someone sexy. The dance club we decided to hit was one of those ones you'd see in the movies. The music could be heard and felt from down the street. Bright, colorful lights flashed constantly through the ever-opening and closing doors. There were no windows to see into the club, and the longest line stretched from the entrance all the way down the street. I don't want to brag, but we were feeling confident that night, so we skipped the line and went straight to the front. The bouncer took one look at us and let us in, much to the disapproval of the people waiting in line. The night went by slowly, as things tend to do when you're drunk and getting drunker. We danced, we flirted, and I only had to pay for about 2 drinks. It was turning into the best night. Things kind of went downhill after a while. We were sitting at a table, resting our sore legs after almost an hour straight of dancing, when one of my friends noticed there was a man staring at us. Now, don't get me wrong. We get men staring at us all the time, but this was different. It had nothing to do with the fact that none of us found him the least bit attractive. It was the way he was staring at us. His eyes were unblinking behind his thin glasses, and I swear I saw him lick his lips a few times. He looked like a hungry lion stalking his prey. It made us uncomfortable. We were used to dealing with weirdos, and we weren't about to let him ruin our night. So we tried our best to ignore him. Then, he moved closer. He left his table and moved to the one directly across from us. I could feel the hair all over my body standing on end every time I looked over and caught his glaze. I suggested we leave and go to a quieter club for the rest of the night. My friends must have been just as freaked out as me because it didn't take much convincing. I paid our tab and we left. As we walked down the road, I decided to glance over my shoulder. I'm not sure why I did it. Something was telling me to look behind me, and I did. Just as my eyes hit the door of the club we just left, I saw the man walking out. His eyes met mine, and I saw a smile stretch across his face before he started making his way towards us. I shot my head around. My blood turned cold and a shiver ran all over my body. I stepped to the side slightly. My initial thought was to scream as loud as I could and run for it. I was worried that he would chase after us. I grabbed my friend's arm and squeezed tightly until I got her attention. When she leaned close to me, I whispered into her ear. We slowed our pace for a moment. The street in front of us was dark and empty, and if we walked back, we would have to walk straight towards the man. My eyes spotted a man walking towards the club on the other side of the street. I didn't give myself time to think about it. I grabbed my friend's arms and ran across the street towards the man. He was a bit baffled at first. Once we told him about the man following us, he became very protective. He escorted us to his car and stayed with us until we got a ride. I'm very thankful for that man because I still believe to this day that he saved our lives. A few years later in 1999, we heard about a man named Luis Garavito, or as most Colombians know him, La Bestia. He is considered to be one of the world's worst serial killers. It is believed that he had over 300 victims, even though he only confessed to 147. Why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you this because when I saw his face in the newspapers the day he was handed his sentence, there was no denying it. It was the same man that followed me and my friends out of the dance club that night. I could never mistake those hungry eyes hidden behind his thin glasses. That night scarred me, so I would never have forgotten that face. The newspaper said that all of his victims were young boys, but that doesn't stop me from wondering if my friends and I might have been added to his long list of victims that night. The worst part about all this is, he was only sentenced to 30 years in prison, and he might be walking the streets again very soon. Story number 3. The Ritual. I went to Indonesia on vacation somewhere in the early 2000s. I know it's not the best destination for a vacation, but I was broke and the flights were cheap. At that point in my life, any vacation was better than no vacation. I had just broken up with my boyfriend of 4 years. My method of coping involved locking myself in a dark room and crying over romantic movies while eating mountains of ice cream and cake. This method went directly against my older sister's methods. She convinced me that I needed a break, and she even offered to come with me. I'll admit it was nice. We were in a whole new country, and for a moment, I even forgot about my ex. We mostly went on guided tours and ate at interesting restaurants. That was enough for me. My sister was always very adventurous. The one day we went on another tour, only this time my sister was our guide. She rented a car and we drove out to the rural areas. She said something about wanting to see the sugarcane fields. I have no idea why. She was obsessed with it at the time, and I had learned never to question her weird urges. We found a sugarcane field that satisfied her, and I had to take a couple of pictures. She posed, and I actually enjoyed it. I was out in the sun, and my sister always knew how to make me laugh. At some point, she disappeared into the field. I was hesitant to follow her, but I also didn't want to stay on the side of the road all by myself. I walked into the sugarcane field and called out for her. All I heard in response was a distant giggle. I followed the giggling as best I could until I caught up with her. Now, I didn't catch up with her as much as she stopped running away. When I found her, she was frozen stiff and staring at the ground with wide eyes and a gaping mouth. I followed her gaze. I won't go into detail about what we saw, because it still makes me sick just thinking about it. There was a head sticking out of the ground. Not just a head, but the shoulders and torso were also sticking out of the ground. Someone had been buried waist deep in the ground in the middle of the sugarcane field. I was sick to my core and could barely move. Eventually, I managed to grab my sister's arm, and I began pulling her away from the body. I glanced to the side and spotted another body, also waist deep in the ground. I kept my eyes forward, terrified that I would see more. As I was pulling my sister away from the body and back in the direction of the car, I heard footsteps. They were charging towards us, crunching on the rocks and the dirt. The sugarcanes ahead of us bent out of the way. I heard the voice of a man screaming at us in a language I didn't understand. Suddenly, my sister snapped out of it. She grabbed my hand and we took off running through the field. We made it back to the car and sped down the road. We didn't say anything until we got back to the hotel. We contemplated getting the police involved, but neither of us knew where we were or even what we just saw. I know it seems wrong, but we just boarded a flight the next day and pretended the whole thing never happened. A few years ago, during my studies, I was tasked with researching and documenting serial killers from around the globe. That's when I heard about Ahmad Suradji, a cattle breeder from Indonesia that admitted to and was found guilty of killing around 40 girls. That by itself was enough to send shivers down my spine, but I kept reading, and the next piece of information I read made my skin crawl. Ahmad Suradji admitted to killing women and burying their bodies waist deep in his sugarcane fields, with their head facing his house as some part of a ritual to give him power. Even though I don't have any proof, I'm convinced that the man who was running at us in the sugarcane fields that day was Ahmad Suradji. Me and my sister came face to face with a serial killer, and we didn't even know it.